Good morning. Today I wanted to talk about open source AI. Even though we've been debating it for a couple of years now, it is still very relevant and still very controversial. So let's talk a little bit about what is open source AI, if anybody agrees, why it's important, and what people are doing or thinking about it. A bit of history is important to set context. And in the open source software world, free software was originally created on 4 freedoms that I'll reference later. But the ability to use the software, be able to learn from it and examine it, modify it, and redistribute it. And we used copyright law in order to make open source software enforceable. And copyright law was originally created for the written word and for works later applied to works of art and movies. And now it's applied to software. And it's not a perfect fit, even just for plain old open source software. But when you look at the AI models, which are much more complicated, like there's AI models, there's like a data set that it trains on, there's software to train it, there's these weights that are created and get modified. It's really not simple, and you're taking copyright law, which was written for like books and letters and things like that, and you're applying it to this very complex system, which I would argue we're still learning about and still figuring out what it means. But nobody would disagree that it's very important. All of us know that we're using AI in many aspects of our life. The gimbal that I'm using to hold this camera is actually AI powered. So it's really important that we understand the systems that we're depending on and that we can trust them and know that they're respecting our data and privacy and well-being. So things like the EU AI Act have come out, and that also has implications for open source that we'll discuss. So what does it mean to be open source AI? Definitions vary widely, but I would say they fall into like 3 main camps. One is that the model can be tweaked and retrained and redistributed. So just the model itself, not the original data, not the original training. And so the opponents to this argue in multiple ways. One is this is not enough. You can't recreate it. You can't examine it and see how it was created to see if you could trust it and how it's treating your data. 2, the second opposition to that is that you're really just enabling community people to do free product management for these large AI models. The second definition is that everything that you need everything possible to recreate an AI model. So you need all the training data, you need the software that was used to train it, you need the original weights, you need the model, you need all the components so that you could recreate the actual model. Hardcore components of open source software and free software definitely push for this. I'm glad there's people pushing for that set. I think it's really complicated in reality. I almost feel like the models are becoming almost like people. And could you actually recreate a person? Like even if you had my DNA and you knew how I grew up and you could somehow put my parents in the model and all the random people I met in the street, could you recreate me? I think that's complicated. But something we need that transparency is something we need to strive for. The third definition of open source AI, and these are just using very broad buckets to create categories. But the third category would be people that say we don't really need a new model or a new license. Like let's just apply open source licenses to all the components of AI. So to be open source, you have to put an open source license on the data, on the training software, on the model, on the weights. Like just put a license on all of it. I think that's rather naive because, like I said, open source was built on this copyright law, and I just don't think it applies that easily to all the components of an AI system. So those are kind of the 3 buckets that people are using to define OpenAI. And I told you I would look at history, and I think if we go back and we look at the history of open source, if you look at those 4 freedoms, use, learn, modify, distribute, none of them say collaboration. And collaboration, I mean, you could say maybe is implied in modify and distribute, but collaboration the way we have it now with like maintainers and committers and pull requests and the way people interact and kind of the culture and social norms around it, that wasn't originally like the goal. That's what that's what we created. And I think when we look at AI itself is being created into something we don't totally know what it is yet. And I think if we make an open source AI, it'll also create something different and new. Like, what if the AI models themselves are contributors to other AI models? I mean, I don't think we know what it looks like quite yet. The other piece in history that I think is interesting to examine in light of open source AI is software as a service, the SaaS model. So when SaaS first came out, the open source software community was really worried that it would be a loophole to open source, that companies would be able to take open source software, they would put it on their servers, they could afford to have lots of big servers, they would modify it, and then instead of distributing the software to users, which would have triggered the GPL clause that said they had to provide the source code and their modifications, they were just providing it on their servers to their users, and so they would never have to give up their modifications and their contributions. They'd never have to contribute. So we created the AGPL in response to that, the Faro GNU public license, which said if you were using the software as a service, you also had to provide the source code for that. I would argue that that was never a success. Like, AGPL never really took off. There were different modifications of the license. Different people have tried to solve the problem. I think there's still a problem there. And yet I think it hasn't been the open source killer that everyone thought it would be. Still 90% of the world's software is open source software. And I think there was something to be learned there. We didn't get it right then. And I think with the open source AI, there's a chance that we don't get it right. And so we have to be able to pivot, and we have to understand our goal. And as a community, we need to understand, what is it that we're really concerned about? Is it this trust and transparency? Is it not allowing large corporations to control our software? Is it about equal opportunities? Like, what is it that we're trying to accomplish so that we can make sure that we continue to tweak and adjust what it means to be open source AI? And a really important piece of this is different legislation that might come out that might be depending on how we define open source AI. So the EU AI Act carves out some exceptions for open source software, open source AI systems, in order to make sure that the requirements on projects aren't too onerous, that they can still continue to develop AI components in open source without having to provide things that maybe an individual or a small project couldn't provide. And so in order to do that, they have to define what open source AI is. But in the EU AI Act, it actually has clauses that say, like, what high risk AI systems can be used for. And if you go back to the open source definition, one of the main things is that you don't restrict what software can be used for, because that's a freedom. And so we have kind of this catch-22 system where we're trying to define what AI is and how it can be used and what responsibilities companies and individuals have in the AI world, while we're still trying to define what open source AI really means. And so I think it's a catch-22 problem, and goes back to, we have to understand what it is we're trying to accomplish, so that we can continue to tweak it as we figure out what side effects or what world AI creates, and what world or what side effects and what communities and what models open source AI could create. So I think the moral of the story is, we all need to continue to work together. As the OSI was defining the open source AI definition, as the world was defining the open source AI definition, there was a lot of controversy and a lot of arguments and a lot of disagreement. And I think those are good for sharing ideas and for making sure that we consider each other's opinions and opinions we might not have heard. But I think more importantly, we need to continue to define what is our goal with open source AI. And it might be multiple things. Is it to make sure that we can continue to trust our AI systems? Is to make sure they respect our privacy, that we respect the privacy of the data it was trained on, that we know what data it was trained on, that we understand if our data was used when we trained it. Do we want to create some kind of collaborative model like we have in open source? Is that what we're expecting to happen in the AI world, or AI players in that world? So I think we just need to keep in mind the goal. So please, in the comments, drop what your definition of OpenAI is and why. Like why, what's important to you in creating an open source AI definition.